Theo never meant to stand out. Not once in his 32 years had he chased after the spotlight or dreamed of hearing a crowd chant his name. Some people are born craving attention. Theo wasn't one of them. The worn piano bench beneath him felt familiar as he ran his fingers across the keys. The practice room was empty except for him and the old upright piano that had seen better days. Its middle C key stuck sometimes, and the pedals squeaked if you pressed too hard. But Theo loved it anyway. This small room tucked away in the back corner of Melody Music Studios had been his refuge for nearly 7 years now. Outside, the autumn rain tapped against the single window. Theo glanced at his watch, still 40 minutes before his next student arrived. He closed his sheet music and let his hands wander freely across the keys, playing whatever came to mind. This was his favorite part of the day, these stolen moments when he could simply play for himself. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Theo sighed, the spell broken. The number wasn't one he recognized. Hello? Is this Theodore Liang? The woman's voice was brisk, professional. Yes, speaking. This is Isabel Donovan from Harrington Academy of Music. Your name was recommended to us by Rodrigo at Melody Studios. We're in need of a pianist for our spring showcase, and rather urgently. Our regular accompanist has suffered a wrist injury and won't recover in time. Theo's eyebrows rose. Harrington was the most prestigious music academy in the city. Their spring showcase was a big deal. Music critics attended, as did scouts from major orchestras and record labels. It was where promising young musicians got discovered. I'm flattered, Theo said carefully. But that's a pretty high-profile event. It is, Isabel agreed, which is why we need someone reliable. Rodrigo speaks very highly of your sight reading abilities and your professionalism. Theo couldn't help but smile at that. Old Rodrigo always looking out for his musicians. Still, something didn't add up. You must have a list of accomplished pianists you usually call for these situations, he pointed out. There was a slight pause before Isabel answered. We do. But the spring showcase is about showcasing our students, the next generation of musical talent. What we need is someone who won't draw attention away from them, Theo finished for her. Precisely. At least she was honest. Someone who can provide flawless musical support without showing off, Theo said. I wouldn't phrase it quite that way, but essentially, yes. The performance needs to center on our vocalists and instrumentalists. The accompanist needs to enhance their performances, not compete with them. Theo understood perfectly. They wanted a pianist good enough not to make mistakes, but modest enough to stay in the background. He'd played that role his entire career. Session musician, piano teacher, accompanist. Always the supporting character, never the lead. When do rehearsals begin? He asked. Monday morning, 9 a.m. The showcase is in 6 weeks. After working out the details and pay, which was surprisingly generous, Theo hung up and turned back to the piano. He played a simple scale, then a more complex one, followed by a piece he'd composed years ago, but never shared with anyone. His fingers flew across the keys, building to a crescendo that filled the small room with sound. Then, deliberately, he pulled back, softened his touch, made the music blend into the background like audible wallpaper, pleasant but unremarkable. This was what Harrington was paying for. This was what he'd give them. The next Monday, Theo arrived at Harrington Academy 30 minutes early. The building itself was intimidating. All gleaming wood and polished brass, with framed photos of famous alumni lining the hallways. National orchestra members, award-winning composers, platinum-selling recording artists, all had once walked these same corridors. He found the main rehearsal room and slipped inside, relieved to find it empty. The grand piano waiting for him was a Steinway concert model worth more than everything Theo owned combined. He set his messenger bag down gently and approached it with something close to reverence. Go ahead, said a voice from the doorway. That's what it's there for. Theo turned to see a tall woman with a silver streak in her dark hair watching him with amusement. She wore a simple black dress and carried a stack of sheet music. You must be Theodore, she said, walking toward him with an extended hand. I'm Vivian Knox, vocal director. Her handshake was firm. "Please call me Theo," he replied. "Theo, then. Have you had a chance to look over the program I emailed?" He nodded. "I've practiced most of the pieces already. There were a few I wasn't familiar with, but they seemed straightforward enough." Vivian's eyes narrowed slightly, assessing him. "Would you mind playing through the Schubert piece? It's particularly challenging for the accompanist." It was a test, Theo realized. He nodded and took his seat at the piano as Vivian handed him the sheet music. The piece was indeed tricky, with a deceptively simple melody over complex, rippling arpeggios. Theo read through it once silently, then began to play. His fingers found the keys naturally, drawing out the delicate emotion of the piece without overpowering the space where a vocalist would shine. When he finished, Vivian was nodding with satisfaction. "Excellent," she said. "You have a lovely touch, sensitive to the needs of the vocalist." "Thank you," Theo replied, fighting the urge to show her what he could really do if given free rein. Over the next hour, students began filtering in. Young musicians between 16 and 20, all with exceptional talent. Theo was introduced simply as our accompanist for the showcase, and most barely glanced at him before continuing their conversations. A lanky boy with wild curls set up his cello near the piano. "Hey," he said with a friendly nod. "I'm Dom. Fair warning, I sometimes speed up during the middle section." "I'll keep up," Theo promised with a smile. As rehearsal began in earnest, Theo settled into a familiar role. He followed each student, carefully, adjusting his playing to complement their strengths and gently compensate for their weaknesses. When a flutist struggled with breath control, he subtly slowed the tempo. When a violinist attacked a passage with unexpected ferocity, he matched her intensity while staying just beneath her volume. "Very nice work today," Vivian told him afterward. "You're exactly what we need, responsive and unobtrusive." Unobtrusive. The word stuck with Theo on his bus ride home. It wasn't an insult. Being unobtrusive was literally the job description. And yet, that evening, in his small apartment, Theo sat at his own piano, a digital keyboard with weighted keys that was the best he could fit in the limited space. He pulled out music he hadn't played in years. Liszt, Rachmaninoff, Chopin. Pieces that demanded attention, that were designed to showcase the pianist's technical skill and emotional depth. He played until his downstairs neighbor thumped on the ceiling, then switched to headphones, and continued until his fingers ached, and his eyes grew heavy. When he finally fell into bed, Theo wondered what the talented Harrington students would think if they knew their quiet accompanist could play circles around most of them. It didn't matter. He wasn't there to impress anyone. He was there to do a job, to provide the musical foundation upon which others could shine. It was a role he knew well. In the weeks that followed, Theo settled into a comfortable routine. Mornings at Harrington, afternoons teaching at Melody Studios, evenings practicing or picking up the occasional gig at a hotel lounge or wedding. The showcase preparations progressed smoothly, and Theo found himself enjoying the challenge of supporting so many different musical styles and personalities. Some of the Harrington students began to warm to him, asking his advice on phrasing or timing. Dom the cellist often stayed after rehearsal to work on troublesome passages, and Theo found himself looking forward to these impromptu sessions. A few of the faculty members would nod to him in the hallways now, though most still looked through him rather than at him. Only Vivian seemed to watch him with curious eyes sometimes, especially when he would arrive early and warm up with pieces, not on the program. Once she walked in while he was playing a jazz improvisation based on a melody that had been stuck in his head for days. "That's lovely," she said, causing Theo to jump slightly and miss a note. "Your own composition?" "Just something I was playing around with," he said, embarrassed to be caught. "You have quite a gift," she observed. "Do you perform your own work often?" Theo shook his head. "Not really. I'm mostly an accompanist." Was all she said before changing the subject to that day's rehearsal schedule. 3 weeks into rehearsals, the program director, a stern man named Lawrence, gathered everyone to make an announcement. "As you know, the spring showcase is our most important event of the year," he reminded them. his gaze sweeping across the room. Many of you will be performing for industry professionals who can open doors to your future careers. Everything must be perfect. His eyes landed on Theo. That means everyone must understand their role. The accompanist's job is to support, not to distract. No flourishes, no improvisation, nothing that might pull focus from our featured performers. Is that understood? Theo nodded, face carefully blank. Of course. That's why I'm here. Lawrence seemed satisfied and moved on to discuss stage arrangements. Beside Theo, Dom leaned over and whispered, "Don't mind him. He's always like that before showcases. Total control freak." Theo just shrugged. Lawrence wasn't saying anything he didn't already know. Stay in the background. Be invisible. Play the notes on the page. Nothing more. It was what he'd always done. But as he walked home that evening, watching his breath cloud in the cold air, Theo couldn't help wondering if it was all he was meant to do. Theo started arriving at Harrington Academy an hour before rehearsals. The quiet building, with morning light streaming through tall windows, became his favorite place to think and play, really play, the way he never could once others arrived. The grand piano in the rehearsal room called to him like an old friend. Each morning, Theo would warm up with classical pieces he'd memorized years ago, then drift into jazz, improvisation, or his own compositions. In these stolen moments, his music filled the space completely, bold, complex, and uninhibited. Here, alone, he wasn't background noise. He was simply himself. One particularly cold Tuesday, Theo lost track of time. His fingers danced across the keys as he worked through a piece he'd been composing for months, a melancholy melody that built into something hopeful and bright. His body swayed with the music, eyes closed, completely unaware of the world around him. The final notes were still hanging in the air when he heard quiet applause. Theo's eyes snapped open to find Vivian standing just inside the doorway, a strange expression on her face. "That was extraordinary," she said. Heat rushed to Theo's face. "I'm sorry, I was just warming up." Vivian walked closer, her head tilted slightly. "That wasn't Chopin or Mozart. What was that piece?" Theo closed the fallboard over the keys, suddenly uncomfortable. "Nothing, really. Just something I've been working on." "You wrote that?" Vivian's eyebrows rose. "Theo, that was beautiful, complex, and emotional. Why haven't you mentioned you compose?" He shrugged, busying himself with arranging sheet music. "It never came up, and it's not relevant to what you hired me for." "Perhaps not," she agreed, studying him with new interest. "But it certainly changes my understanding of who's been sitting at that piano these past weeks." Students began filtering in before she could say more, and Theo was grateful for the interruption. Throughout the rehearsal, though, he caught Vivian watching him with thoughtful eyes. The following day, Theo noticed small changes. For the first time, Vivian introduced him by name to a visiting faculty member. During a difficult passage in a violinist's piece, she suggested Theo might add a bit more color to the accompaniment, and when rehearsal ended, she asked him to stay behind. "I've been thinking about your playing yesterday," she said once they were alone. Theo tensed. "I promise it won't happen during the showcase. I understand my role." "That's not what I was going to say," Vivian interrupted gently. "I wanted to ask if you'd consider sharing your compositions with me. The conservatory is always looking for new pieces for our intermediate students." The request caught him off guard. "I don't really have anything formal written down, I just play." "Then perhaps we could record you someday," she suggested. "Your work deserves to be heard." Theo mumbled something non-committal and excused himself, unsettled by the conversation. He wasn't used to people taking interest in his original music. It felt both flattering and frightening. The next week brought more subtle shifts. Dom, the cellist, overheard Theo playing around with a jazzier interpretation of his showcase piece before rehearsal. "That was cool," Dom said, setting down his cello case. "Way more interesting than the straight version." "Just messing around," Theo replied, reverting immediately to the standard arrangement. "No, seriously," Dom persisted. That had groove. What if we tried it that way? Before Theo could object, Dom had called over two other students, a violinist named Ren and a clarinetist called Zoe. You guys have to hear what Theo was just doing with my piece. Reluctantly, Theo played his jazzier take again. To his surprise, the students loved it. That's so much better, Zoe declared. It makes the piece feel alive. Can we try it? Ren asked. Just to see how it sounds? Theo glanced nervously toward the door. Lawrence was pretty clear about sticking to the arrangements. Lawrence isn't here, Dom pointed out. Just once through, please? Unable to resist their enthusiasm, Theo gave in. They played through Dom's showcase piece with the new arrangement, and it was magical. The students responded to the energy, finding new expression in a piece they'd rehearsed dozens of times. When they finished, more applause startled them. Vivian stood in the doorway with 3 other faculty members. Well, said an older woman Theo recognized as the head of the strings department. That was unexpected. Theo's stomach dropped. I apologize for the deviation from the arrangement. Don't apologize, the woman cut in. That was the most I've seen Dom enjoy playing that piece since he chose it. Beside her, a younger teacher nodded. There was life in it. Real feeling. Only the third teacher, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, seemed less impressed. It's hardly appropriate for the showcase format. The focus should be on technique, not whatever that was. Vivian stepped forward. I think what we just witnessed was musicality, Harold. Something we're supposedly teaching here. She turned to the students. What did you all think of the arrangement? It was awesome, Dom said without hesitation. It felt like the piece was finally working. I could hear how my part fit in better, Zoe added. And it was fun, Ren said. Like, actually fun to play. Harold sniffed disapprovingly but didn't argue further. The older woman, Dr. Lee, Theo now remembered, studied him with interest. You have quite a talent for arrangement, Mr. Liang. Where did you study? Community college, Theo admitted. I couldn't afford conservatory. Something flickered across Dr. Lee's face. Surprise, perhaps, or reassessment. Interesting. Well, carry on. We didn't mean to interrupt. The faculty, members departed, already deep in discussion. Vivian lingered behind. See what happens when you step out of the background a little, she said quietly before following her colleagues. In the days that followed, word spread among the students about Theo's arranging skills. One by one, they approached him. Could he help make their showcase pieces more interesting? Could he show them how to add those cool jazz chords? Would he listen to their interpretation and give feedback? For the first time in his professional life, people were asking for Theo's musical opinion rather than just his accompaniment. It was both flattering and uncomfortable, like wearing new shoes that hadn't been broken in yet. Lawrence, unsurprisingly, was less enthusiastic about these developments. Theo often felt the program director's disapproving gaze during rehearsals, especially when students asked him questions or when Vivian encouraged him to try something different with an accompaniment. 3. Weeks before the showcase, Lawrence called Theo into his office. The room was immaculate, with awards and diplomas covering one wall and a view of the academy gardens through a large window. Mr. Liang, Lawrence began, not offering Theo a seat. I want to remind you of the purpose of your position here. Understand my role, sir, Theo replied. Do you? Because it seems to me you're forgetting that you were hired as an accompanist, not a featured performer or an arranger. Theo kept his expression neutral. I've only been trying to help the students when they ask for input. That's not your job, Lawrence said flatly. We have faculty for that purpose, experienced educators with appropriate credentials. Your job is to provide accompaniment as written, nothing more. The words stung, but they weren't anything Theo hadn't told himself countless times before. Know your place, stay in the background, of course, he said. I apologize for overstepping. Lawrence nodded, satisfied. The spring showcase has a specific format and purpose. It's about showcasing our students' technical proficiency and classical training. Jazz interpretations and improvisation have no place in this program. I understand completely, Theo said, though something inside him rebelled at the words. Music was meant to evolve and breathe, not be preserved like a museum piece. That evening, as Theo practiced in his apartment, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was Dom. Hey Theo, got your cellar from the contact sheet. Some of us are meeting at Zoe's place tomorrow to work on our pieces. Want to come? We could use your ear. Theo stared at the message for a long time. Lawrence would definitely disapprove. But these were exactly the kinds of musical connections he'd always wanted. Other musicians who valued his input and creativity. Before he could overthink it, he texted back, "What time?" The unofficial rehearsal at Zoe's house was unlike anything at Harrington. Students sprawled on couches and floor cushions, instruments were passed around, and everyone contributed ideas. When Theo suggested a different approach to a tricky passage in Wren's violin piece, no one questioned his authority to do so. They simply tried it, decided they liked it, and moved on. For the first time in years, Theo felt like a real musician among peers, not just hired help. The realization was both exhilarating and painful, a glimpse of what his musical life could have been all along. You should play something for us, Dom suggested during a break, nodding toward the upright piano in the corner of Zoe's living room. I'm here to help you guys, Theo deflected. Come on, Zoe insisted. We've been working for hours. We deserve a little concert. With all eyes on him, Theo reluctantly sat at the piano. For a moment, his mind went blank. What should he play? Then, taking a deep breath, he began one of his own compositions, a piece that started gently before building into something rich and complex. When he finished, the room was silent. Then Dom whispered, "Holy crap." That was amazing, Wren said, eyes wide. Like seriously amazing, why are you just an accompanist? The question hung in the air, and Theo had no good answer. Why indeed? The final 2 weeks before the showcase flew by in a blur of rehearsals. After his warning from Lawrence, Theo tried to fade back into the background. He played the arrangements as written, kept his suggestions minimal, and avoided drawing attention to himself. But something had changed. The students now looked at him differently, with respect, even admiration. They'd seek him out during breaks, asking questions about music theory or performance tips in hushed voices. You're still coming to our practice session tonight, right? Dom whispered as they packed up after Thursday's rehearsal. Theo glanced around nervously. I shouldn't. Lawrence made it pretty clear. Lawrence doesn't need to know, Zoe cut in, pretending to adjust her clarinet case. Besides, we're not doing anything wrong. Just some friends getting together to practice. Friends, Theo repeated softly. The word felt good, unfamiliar, but good. Their unofficial rehearsals had continued twice weekly, always at someone's home rather than at the academy. Word had spread, and now nearly a third of the showcase performers attended. Theo found himself at the center of these gatherings, offering guidance that blended technical advice with emotional interpretation, the kind of teaching he'd always wished to do. That evening's session was at Wren's apartment, crowded but vibrant, with creative energy. As they worked through challenging passages and discussed musical choices, Theo felt more alive than he had in years. You know what's funny? Dom said during a pizza break. You're supposed to be the guy in the background, but you're basically our secret teacher now. Don't say that, Theo protested, though warmth spread through his chest at the words. It's true, another student chimed in. I've learned more about musicality from you in 2 weeks than from a whole semester with Professor Harold. You guys are just being nice, Theo said, embarrassed by the praise. Wren shook his head. No, we're being honest. You've got something special, Theo. Something real. The conversation shifted to showcase preparations, but Wren's words lingered in Theo's mind long after the session ended. Something special. Something real. Was that true? Or had he spent so many years convincing himself otherwise that he couldn't see his own potential? The next morning, Theo arrived at Harrington earlier than usual. The academy was silent, hallways empty in the pre-dawn quiet. He settled at the piano and began playing. Not his usual warm-up, but a piece he'd been working on for years yet never finished. It was the most personal music he'd ever written, full of longing and quiet determination. "That's beautiful." Theo's hands froze on the keys. He turned to find not Vivian, as he'd expected, but Dr. Lee, the head of the strings department. "I'm sorry," he said automatically. "I was just—" "Please don't apologize for playing like that," Dr. Lee said, walking into the room. "Is it yours?" Theo nodded reluctantly. "I thought so. It has your voice." She set her bag down and regarded him thoughtfully. "You know, I've been teaching here for 23 years. I can count on one hand the number of musicians I've met with genuine compositional talent." Theo shifted uncomfortably on the bench. "I'm not really a composer." "What I just heard suggests otherwise," Dr. Lee interrupted. "Why haven't you pursued it?" The question was asked without judgment, just simple curiosity. Still, Theo found himself struggling to answer. "I guess I never thought I was good enough," he finally admitted. "And then it became easier to just be the guy who plays other people's music." Dr. Lee nodded slowly. "The background becomes comfortable, doesn't it? Even when we know we belong elsewhere." Something in her tone suggested she was speaking from experience. Before Theo could respond, she continued, "I understand Lawrence spoke to you about your role here." Theo tensed. "Yes, and he was right. I was hired as an accompanist, not a teacher or arranger." "Lawrence has very traditional views about music education," Dr. Lee said diplomatically. "He's built a successful program on those principles, and I respect that. But—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Not every student thrives under such rigid structures. I've noticed a remarkable improvement in several performers since you arrived, particularly Dom and Zoe. They're talented kids," Theo said. "They just needed a little encouragement." "Precisely. Encouragement to find their own voices, not just technical perfection." Dr. Lee smiled slightly. "Much like you might need." Students began arriving before their conversation could continue, but Dr. Lee's words echoed in Theo's mind throughout the day. Find his own voice. After so many years of deliberate silence, was that even possible? The following Monday, disaster struck. Anton, the showcase's star pianist, arrived at rehearsal with his right hand heavily bandaged. "Stupid accident," he explained, face drawn with pain and frustration. "Slammed it in a car door yesterday. Doctor says no playing for at least 3 weeks." The news sent ripples of concern through the room. Anton's performance, a challenging Rachmaninoff piece, was supposed to be the centerpiece of the showcase, strategically placed in the middle of the program. Lawrence called an emergency faculty meeting immediately. Theo was asked to stay, behind with the students running through other pieces while the teachers decided what to do about this crisis. "They'll probably cut the piece entirely," Dom predicted gloomily as they took a break. "Which messes up the whole flow of the showcase. Or they'll bring in a ringer, some faculty member to take Anton's spot," Zoe suggested. "That's not fair," Ren protested. "This is supposed to be a student showcase." The faculty returned after nearly an hour, faces serious. Lawrence stepped forward to address the group. "As you're all aware, we have a situation with Anton's performance. After careful consideration, we've decided not to remove the Rachmaninoff from the program." Surprised murmurs spread through the room. Instead, Lawrence continued, looking like he'd swallowed something bitter. "Mr. Liang will perform the piece." Theo's head snapped up. "What?" "You're familiar with the composition, yes?" Lawrence asked stiffly. "Well, yes, but—" "Then it's settled." Lawrence cut him off. "You'll step in for Anton. The program is already printed and we can't disappoint the patrons who were expecting to hear the Rachmaninoff. Dr. Lee assures me you're capable." The last word carried a hint of doubt that stung Theo's pride. Before he could respond, Lawrence turned to the rest of the group. "This is an unfortunate situation, but the showcase must proceed as planned. Mr. Liang, please see me after rehearsal to discuss the details." As Lawrence walked away, students surrounded Theo with excited congratulations. Only Anton hung back, expression unreadable. Theo approached him quietly. I'm really sorry about your hand, and I don't have to do this if you're not comfortable with it. Anton's shoulders slumped. No, it's fine. Better you than some stranger, I guess. You've been cool to all of us. He hesitated, then added, Just do it justice, okay? I worked really hard on that piece. I promise, Theo said solemnly. The meeting with Lawrence after rehearsal was brief and uncomfortable. Let me be clear, the program director said once. They were alone. This is not what I wanted, but we had limited options, and Vivian and Dr. Lee were insistent about your abilities. I understand, Theo replied, keeping his voice neutral. I'll keep it simple and technically sound, just as Anton would have played it. Lawrence's eyes narrowed slightly. See that you do. Remember that even in this unexpected role, your job is still to represent the Academy appropriately. No improvisations or stylistic experiments. Theo nodded stiffly. Of course. As he gathered his things to leave, Lawrence added, And Mr. Liang? Don't get used to the spotlight. This is a one-time emergency solution, nothing more. The words were meant to put him in his place, but for once they didn't land as intended. Instead, Theo felt something unexpected stir inside him. Not anger, but determination. That night, alone in his apartment, Theo pulled out his copy of the Rachmaninoff. It was a piece he knew intimately, had played it countless times for his own enjoyment, though never for an audience. His fingers moved through the complex passages with practiced ease. But now, knowing he would perform it at the showcase, he played differently. Not as an accompanist, not as background music, but as a soloist, with all the emotion and interpretation the piece deserved. His phone rang, interrupting his practice. It was Vivian. I wanted to check how you're feeling about the Rachmaninoff, she said without preamble. Fine, Theo answered cautiously. Lawrence made it clear how I should approach it. A short sigh came through the phone. Yes, I imagine he did. And what do you think of his instructions? Theo hesitated. It doesn't matter what I think. I was hired to do a job. You were hired as an accompanist, Vivian agreed. But circumstances have changed. Now you're a performer. For one piece only, Theo reminded her. And then back to the background. Is that really what you want? Vivian asked softly. To always remain in the background? The question hung between them, deceptively simple yet impossibly complex. I don't know, Theo admitted finally. I've been there so long, I'm not sure I know how to be anywhere else. Well, Vivian said, in 10 days you'll have no choice but to step into the spotlight, even if just for 7 minutes. What you do with those minutes is entirely up to you. After they hung up, Theo sat in silence, her words echoing in his mind. What you do with those minutes is entirely up to you. For the first time in years, perhaps ever, Theo allowed himself to imagine playing not as someone expected him to, but as he truly wanted to. Not just technically perfect, but personally meaningful. Not in the background, but center stage. The thought was terrifying. It was also exhilarating. Theo turned back to the piano and began to play again, this time allowing all the emotion he usually kept carefully contained to flow freely through the music. The Rachmaninoff came alive under his fingers, no longer just notes on a page, but a story he was telling. His story. The week before the showcase transformed Theo's routine completely. Suddenly, he wasn't just the accompanist for other performers. He was a featured soloist with his own rehearsal slots. The change felt surreal, like wearing someone else's clothes. Try the middle section again, Vivian suggested during one of these sessions. She'd taken it upon herself to coach him, despite Lawrence's visible disapproval. You're playing it perfectly, but what? Theo asked when she didn't finish her thought. Vivian considered her words carefully. You're playing it the way it's supposed to be played technically, but I'm not hearing you in it yet. Theo's fingers rested on the keys. Lawrence was very specific about how I should approach this. Yes, I know what Lawrence said, Vivian replied with a hint of impatience. I'm asking what you want to say with this piece. The question caught Theo off guard. For so long he'd focused on what others wanted. From his playing. What did he want to say? Did he even know anymore? I'm not sure, he admitted. Vivian nodded as if she'd expected this answer. That's the real work then, isn't it? Finding your voice after all this time. That evening, Theo skipped the unofficial student practice session. Instead, he sat at his keyboard at home, playing the Rachmaninoff over and over. Each time he tried something slightly different, a varied tempo here, a different emphasis there, allowing his emotions to guide his interpretation rather than the strict markings on the page. Around midnight, his phone buzzed with a text from Dom. Missed you tonight, everything okay? Theo stared at the message, touched by the genuine concern. Just practicing the Rachmaninoff, he replied. Getting nervous. Dom's response came quickly. You'll kill it. We've all heard you play. Just do it your way. Your way. The phrase stuck, with Theo as he finally went to bed, exhausted but mind still racing. Did he even have a way anymore? After years of blending in, of making himself musical wallpaper, had he lost his own artistic identity? The next morning, Theo arrived at Harrington to find Anton waiting outside the practice room, his injured hand still bandaged. Hey, Anton said awkwardly. Got a minute? They found an empty classroom and Anton closed the door behind them. Look, he began. I know this is weird, you stepping in for me and all. I'm sorry about your hand, Theo said again. I really am. Anton waved this away with his good hand. Not your fault. Actually, I wanted to say, I've been listening to you practice. The piece. Theo felt a stab of anxiety. I know it's not exactly how you would have played it. No, that's just it, Anton interrupted. It's better. Theo blinked in surprise. What? When I play it, it's technically correct. I've got the speed, the precision. Anton looked down at his bandaged hand. But when you play it, especially when you think no one's listening, it has something mine doesn't. What's that? Theo asked quietly. Anton shrugged. I don't know. Life? Feeling? Whatever it is, it makes people actually want to listen. He met Theo's eyes. Don't let Lawrence make you play it safe. That piece deserves better. I deserve better. Theo didn't know what to say. Getting permission, encouragement even, from Anton himself was the last thing he'd expected. Thanks, he finally managed. That means a lot. The weekend before the showcase, Theo barely left his apartment. He practiced until his fingers ached, until the neighbors complained, until the Rachmaninoff was so embedded in his muscle memory, he could play it in his sleep. But more importantly, he found his interpretation, the story he wanted to tell through the music. Monday's dress rehearsal in the Academy's concert hall was Theo's first time playing the piece with the professional acoustics of the performance space. The enormous Steinway grand piano responded to his touch differently than the practice room piano, with richer tones and more sensitive dynamics. He played through the Rachmaninoff once, sticking closely to the written score and keeping his interpretation restrained, exactly as Lawrence had instructed. The program director nodded with approval from the back of the hall. Good, Lawrence said afterward. Clean, precise, appropriate. Just like that on Thursday night. Theo nodded, avoiding Vivian's gaze. He could feel her disappointment from across the room. During the lunch break, Dr. Lee found him sitting alone in a corner of the green room. You played very well this morning, she said, taking the seat beside him. Thank you. It wasn't you, though, was it? She asked gently. Theo looked up, startled by her perception. I've heard you play when you think no one is listening, Dr. Lee explained. That performance just now, it was technically flawless, but carefully contained. That's what Lawrence wants, Theo said, his voice low. Dr. Lee was quiet for a moment. Did I ever tell you I was a composer once? Theo shook his head, surprised. Years ago, I wrote music that I believed in, that expressed something true. But I was told my style was too experimental, too emotional. She smiled faintly. So I adapted. wrote music that would be accepted, that wouldn't challenge anyone. Eventually, I stopped composing altogether and focused on teaching. Do you regret it? Theo asked. Dr. Lee's gaze turned distant. Every day. Not the teaching, I love my students. But giving up my voice because I was afraid of rejection? She shook her head. That's a special kind of loss that never really heals. She stood, placing a hand briefly on Theo's shoulder. Just something to consider before Thursday night. The final days before the showcase passed in a blur of last-minute preparations. Theo continued playing the Rachmaninoff exactly as Lawrence wanted during rehearsals, while privately practicing his own interpretation at home. He still hadn't decided which version he would actually perform. The night before the showcase, he couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m, Theo gave up trying and sat at his keyboard with headphones. His fingers moved to the Rachmaninoff automatically, but halfway through he stopped. Instead, he began playing the composition he'd been working on for years, but never completed, the one Dr. Lee had heard that morning. As he played, the ending that had eluded him for so long suddenly became clear. The piece wasn't about longing anymore. It was about finding courage, about stepping out of the shadows. Theo recorded the complete piece on his phone, listening back with a mixture of pride and uncertainty. It was the most honest music he'd ever created, and the most frightening. No one would hear it at tomorrow's showcase, but somehow, just finishing it felt important. Thursday evening arrived with the nervous energy that always precedes important performances. The concert hall buzzed with activity, stage managers making final adjustments, students in formal attire pacing backstage, faculty members giving last-minute advice. Theo, dressed in the black suit he'd purchased specifically for this occasion, found a quiet corner to warm up his fingers and focus his thoughts. The program placed the Rachmaninoff precisely in the middle, the showcase's centerpiece. You ready? Dom appeared beside him, cello case in hand. As I'll ever be, Theo replied. Remember what I said, Dom told him with a grin. Your way. 1 by 1 the student performances began. Theo accompanied the first half of the program just as he'd been hired to do, professionally, competently, and without drawing attention to himself. But as his solo approached, he felt a strange calm descend. The decision he'd been wrestling with for days suddenly seemed clear. During intermission, Vivian found him backstage. How are you feeling? She asked. Surprisingly okay, Theo answered. Honestly? She studied his face, then smiled slightly. You've decided, haven't you? He nodded. Whatever choice you've made, she said quietly. I'm proud of you for making it your own decision. The second half of the showcase began. Theo listened, from the wings as a flutist finished her piece, receiving warm applause from the packed auditorium. Then the stage manager was gesturing to him. His turn next. As Theo walked onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily blinded him. He could make out only vague shapes in the audience. Music critics, talent scouts, donors, family members. Somewhere in the back, Lawrence would be watching, expecting the safe, contained performance they'd agreed upon. Theo took his seat at the piano, adjusting the bench slightly. He placed his hands on the keys and took a deep breath. In that moment, all the voices telling him what to do, who to be, how to play. They all fell silent. There was only Theo and the piano, and the music waiting to be born. He closed his eyes briefly, then began to play. The opening notes of the Rachmaninoff filled the concert hall exactly as written. For the first page, Theo played precisely as he had in rehearsal, technically perfect but restrained. He could almost feel Lawrence's approval from the back of the room. Then, as the piece progressed, something shifted. Theo didn't consciously decide to change his interpretation. It simply happened, as natural as breathing. The music began to transform under his fingers, becoming more personal, more alive. He played with all the emotion he'd kept carefully hidden for years, the longing, the frustration, the hope. The piece took on a new dimension. Passages that were meant to be merely impressive became genuinely moving. Technical flourishes turned into emotional statements. The Rachmaninoff wasn't just being performed, it was being reinvented in real time. Theo was dimly aware of the audience leaning forward in their seats. He caught glimpses of Vivian and Dr. Lee at the side of the stage, both watching with bright eyes. Nothing existed except the music. Not Lawrence's expectations, not his own doubts, not the years he'd spent in the background. For 7 minutes, Theo was exactly who he was meant to be. When he played the final chord, letting it resonate through the hall, there was a moment of complete silence. Theo kept his hands on the keys, almost afraid to break the spell. Then came the applause. It started slowly, then built into something Theo had never experienced before. Not just polite appreciation, but genuine, enthusiastic recognition. He stood somewhat dazed and bowed as the applause continued to grow. Looking out at the audience, he could see people rising to their feet, first a few, then entire rows, a standing ovation. For him, the man hired to stay in the background. Theo stood frozen on stage, the applause washing over him in waves. He'd never imagined this moment, had never allowed himself to dream of it. His legs felt unsteady as he bowed again, then made his way off stage. In the wings, students crowded around him, eyes wide with excitement and new respect. "That was incredible," Dom whispered, clapping him on the back. "You just changed the whole game," Ren added. Vivian appeared through the crowd, her usually composed face alight with emotion. "Theo, that was—" She shook her head, seemingly at a loss for words. Before she could continue, a stage manager ushered them all away. The showcase had to continue. Theo found a quiet corner backstage to catch his breath. His hands were still trembling, not from nerves now, but from the sheer intensity of what had just happened. The rest of the showcase proceeded as planned, though it felt somehow different. The audience seemed more engaged, more alive. When Theo returned to his role as accompanist for the final pieces, he played with a new freedom, no longer afraid to be heard. After the final bows, the reception in the Academy's grand foyer buzzed with energy. Students and faculty mingled with donors, critics and industry professionals. Theo hung back, unsure of his place in this new landscape where he was no longer invisible. "There you are," Dr. Lee said, finding him by a window. "Everyone's looking for you." "For me?" Theo still couldn't quite believe it. "Of course for you." She handed him a glass of sparkling water. "You stole the show, whether you meant to or not." Theo sipped the water, buying time. Lawrence must be furious. Dr. Lee's mouth quirked up at one corner. Let's just say he's experiencing some conflicting emotions. The critics are raving about your performance, which reflects well on the Academy. But you certainly didn't follow instructions. "I couldn't," Theo said simply. "Not in the end." "I know." Dr. Lee's eyes softened. "And that's why it was magnificent." Throughout the evening, Theo found himself approached by people he'd never met. Music critics wanting quotes, donors curious about his background, even a representative from a recording label interested in exploring opportunities. It was overwhelming, almost dizzying. He was speaking with a conservatory professor when he felt a tap on his shoulder. Turning, he found himself face to face with Lawrence. The program director's expression was carefully neutral, but Theo could see the tightness around his eyes. "A word, Mr. Liang?" Lawrence didn't wait for a response before walking toward a quieter corner. Theo excused himself and followed, bracing for the confrontation. Whatever came next, being fired, berated, banned from future Academy events, he decided he wouldn't regret his choice. "Your performance was not what we agreed upon," Lawrence began without preamble. "No, it wasn't," Theo acknowledged. There was no point denying it. Lawrence's jaw worked as if he were chewing on his next words. It was also, according to every critic in attendance, the highlight of the evening. That Theo hadn't expected. "I'm glad they enjoyed it." Enjoyed is an understatement. The Times reviewer called it revelatory. The journal said it breathed new life into a piece many consider overplayed. Lawrence still didn't look pleased, despite reciting these glowing reviews. "Several major donors have specifically mentioned your performance as the reason they'll be increasing their contributions to our scholarship fund." Theo remained silent, unsure where this was heading. Lawrence sighed heavily. I don't approve of your methods, Mr. Liang. You were given clear direction, which you chose to ignore, but I cannot argue with results. He straightened his already impeccable tie. The board chairman has suggested we discuss the possibility of you taking on a more visible role at Harrington, perhaps some master classes or special performances. It took a moment for the words to sink in. You're offering me a job, a real one? I'm suggesting we discuss possibilities, Lawrence corrected stiffly. Nothing more at this point. Even this grudging offer felt like victory. I'd be interested in that discussion. Lawrence nodded once, then walked away without another word. Theo watched him go, a smile tugging at his lips. Not approval, certainly, but a form of recognition nonetheless. As the reception wound down, Theo found himself increasingly eager to go home. The evening had been extraordinary but exhausting, and he needed time to process everything that had happened. He was gathering his things when Anton appeared beside him, looking far less upset than Theo might have expected from someone whose spotlight had been stolen. Hey, Anton said, raising his bandaged hand slightly. Not how either of us planned things, but you killed it out there. Thanks, Theo replied. Honestly, I was worried you'd be upset. Anton shook his head. Hard to be mad when you played. It better than I ever could have. Besides, he added with a small smile, there's always next year's showcase. Next year I'll be back to being the accompanist, Theo said automatically. Will you, though? Anton raised an eyebrow. After tonight, I'm not sure you can go back to the background. Some lights are just too bright to hide. The words stayed with Theo on his late-night bus ride home. Could he go back? Did he even want to? For so many years, he'd convinced himself that the background was where he belonged, safe, unnoticed, unexceptional. Now that he'd stepped out of those shadows even briefly, everything looked different. Theo's phone had been buzzing all evening with messages from friends who'd heard about his performance through social media. Even old classmates he hadn't spoken to in years somehow knew about his triumph. Apparently, several audience members had recorded parts of his performance, and the clips were spreading quickly online. When he finally reached his apartment, Theo was too wired to sleep despite the late hour. He sat at his keyboard not to play but just to think. His fingers traced the keys lightly, remembering the feel of the magnificent Steinway under his hands, the sound filling the concert hall, the faces of the audience as they listened, really listened, to his music. A new message notification broke his reverie. It was from Dom. You've gone viral, man. Check your email. Curious, Theo opened his rarely used email app. Among the usual junk were several messages from unfamiliar addresses, a music blog requesting an interview, an indie record producer interested in a meeting, and most surprisingly, an invitation to perform at a well-known piano bar downtown. All sent within the past few hours. The last email made him catch his breath. It was from the director of a prestigious summer music program, one Theo had dreamed of attending as a student, but could never afford. Dear Mr. Liang, it read, after witnessing your remarkable interpretation of Rachmaninoff this evening, I would like to invite you to join our faculty for this summer's session. Our students would benefit greatly from your approach to musical expression and interpretation. Please contact me at your earliest convenience to discuss details. Theo read the email 3 times, hardly believing it was real. Teaching at the summer program, not accompanying but teaching, helping young musicians find their own voices, just as he had finally found his. As dawn broke outside his window, Theo made himself a cup of tea and sat watching the city wake up. For the first time in years, maybe ever, he felt a sense of possibility stretching before him. No longer a narrow path of limited expectations, but an open landscape of choices. His phone rang. It was Vivian. I hope I didn't wake you, she said when he answered. No, I haven't slept yet, Theo admitted, still processing everything. I understand. Listen, I'm calling because there's something I'd like to discuss with you. The Academy has a small concert series throughout the year, intimate performances, experimental programs. I curate it, and I'd like you to consider doing a recital. Your own compositions, perhaps? Theo's heart skipped. My own work? I don't know if it's ready for that. The piece I heard you playing that morning certainly was, Vivian said. And I suspect there's more where that came from. Theo thought about the composition he'd finally completed the night before the showcase, the one that had been inside him for years, waiting to be finished. Maybe, he conceded. Think about it, Vivian urged. No pressure, but I believe people should hear what you have to say through your music. I think you have a lot to say. After they hung up, Theo turned to his keyboard again. This time he began to play, not Rachmaninoff or any other composer's work, but his own music. The piece flowed from his fingers with a new confidence, each note clear and purposeful, no longer hiding, no longer apologizing. 3 months later, Theo stood backstage at Harrington's intimate recital hall. The space was smaller than the main concert hall, but tonight every seat was filled. The program in his hands listed his name not as an accompanist, but as the featured performer. Below that, a list of original compositions, music that had once existed only in the privacy of his apartment, now ready to be shared with the world. Dom poked his head around the corner. Full house out there, you ready? Theo took a deep breath. I think so. Nervous. A little, Theo admitted. It's different when it's your own music. More personal. Dom nodded understandingly. That's what makes it worth hearing. As the house, lights dimmed. Theo thought about how much had changed since that first phone call from Harrington. He'd been hired to stay in the background, to be invisible. Now he was about to walk on stage front and center, playing music that came from his own heart. The stage manager gave him the signal. Theo straightened his shoulders and walked out to the waiting piano. The spotlight felt warm on his face as he took his seat and adjusted the bench. Looking out at the expectant faces, he no longer felt the need to disappear. This was exactly where he was meant to be. As his fingers touched the keys, Theo smiled. The background had been comfortable, but this spotlight felt like home.